You on?
And they said, oh, you got any good beer down there? Does everybody drink Corona and Budweiser? And I said, no, this is really one of the great beer states. It gets better every year. Well, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here. Because, oh, okay.
Sorry. I was so panicky that there are more people coming since it was in the recorder, and the last talk was 300 people.
Well, there might be 300 who they stopped for a beer on the way. Hello.
Does that work?
I'm used to shouting. Hello.
One.
Last call, ladies and gentlemen. No, that's Thank you. Well, now I can say thank you again and be heard. Thank you, Thomas and the museum for inviting me here. I'm really pleased to be here in Santa Fe because historically it's been one of the very important places in the history of beer in New Mexico. The first reference that anybody has found to a brewery in New Mexico was in 1855. Evidently, there was a brewery here in Santa Fe that got destroyed in a flood. So that's all anybody knows about it. And then in the next big event is 26 years ago, 1988, when Santa Fe Brewing Company opens its doors and becomes the first brewery in New Mexico since to brew beer legally and commercially. I'm sure there was a lot of illegal beer brewed in New Mexico too, but legally and commercially since Prohibition. Well, people have asked me, why did I decide to write about beer in New Mexico, about its history and about its current status? Well, there's a bit of personal history involved, and I want to share not my life story. My children would say, oh, not again. They'd say, keep it to 3 seconds, Dad, because that's the exciting part. But do you have children that have grown up like that? But my beer history, which some of you may find rings a bell. Well, I spent my first 3 legal decades of drinking beer in Canada, consuming a beverage that's so mediocre that it was really kind to call it beer. Whatever the company name was on the label, the Bass, Molson's, Carling, whatever it was, the stuff inside was pretty much the same. It was pale, it was pretty fizzy, and at best bland. Well, occasionally I'd pretend I was a citizen of the world, and when we go for Chinese food, I'd have Qingdao. I don't know if any of you have had Qingdao, which is really a German-style beer. The Germans, they started the brewery in China many, many years ago. Or I'd show how sophisticated I was when we went to a fancy steakhouse by having Heineken. I thought, cool. But usually it was just beer. It was cheaper than European imports, and if you had more than 2, you'd have profound thoughts about religion, politics, and sex that you wanted to share with anybody who listened to you. I don't know if you've ever had that experience or not. Usually they were unwilling and faint deafness. Well, in 1986, I discovered that it was more than just beer. One night at the fancy steakhouse in Edmonton, Alberta, the waiter suggested that I try something called traditional ale. It was something new from Calgary, a rival city, 180 miles away. Have you been to Alberta and been to Calgary or Edmonton? We have an old joke in Edmonton about Calgary, which is, we say, a cowboy town. And we say, what's the difference between Calgary and yogurt? Yogurt has culture. You could try that with a lot of twin cities, St. Paul, Minnesota, and so forth. Well, he said it was different. It was an English style called dark mild. It didn't look like beer. It was so dark you could hardly see through it. And it didn't taste like beer. In fact, it had taste, which was much different from what I'd usually have. And then a few months later, I was attending a conference in Wyoming, and a waiter invited me to try something they just started to carry, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Sierra Nevada. It didn't look pale. It was more deep gold or amber. It had a not unpleasant bitterness, a taste different from anything I'd experienced before, and it was really good. I've since learned that for many brewers, tasting Sierra Nevada was what turned their lives around as brewers. In fact, some of you probably know Rob Tweet at Second City here. Not Second City, Second Street. I mean, Second City is the common thing. But that was what turned him on. He'd been out camping with some buddies up in Northern California, and they all went to sleep, and he discovered one of his friends had brought and left in the ice chest some Sierra Nevada. Well, the next day when they went to get it, it was gone. And Rob decided he wanted to be a brewer of good beer that night. It took him a day or so to get over the sixth beer, but I mean, basically that was it. Well, over the next decade, I found myself looking for good beer in my travels. In Montana, I discovered Big Sky's Moose Drool. I don't know if you've ever had Moose Drool. It's a great name, and it's a very good beer. It doesn't taste like Moose Drool. Well, I don't know. I've never had Moose Drool, but it's a really wonderful beer. When I was in Oregon, I tried Bridgeport IPA. Once I was visiting Cooperstown to see the Baseball Hall of Fame, and I discovered a brewery, Omagog Saison. Really, really great stuff. Well, the only time I had beer was when a beer-benighted neighbor would invite me to have a Bud Light with him. And I would have my Bud Light then, but that's been about the only time. In the late 1990s, when I started visiting my daughter who lives down in Albuquerque, teaches at the university, well, I started going away to avoid the Canadian winters. It was 25 below there Celsius last night. But I started trying New Mexico beers. She introduced me to Tractor Farmer's Tan. I don't know if any of you had that red ale. And Santa Fe Pale Ale, which is, I think, a really great pale ale. And Rio Grande's Pancho Verde Chili Cerveza, which is kind of interesting. They brew the beer, and then they have like giant tea bags filled with chili that they soak in the beer for a while to give it the chili taste. Later, I discovered Marble and La Cumbre, which, by the way, is considered one of the best breweries of pale ale in all of North America. And I went to places like Channel River, Il Vicino, and 2nd Street. I got to write that down. One time, when I returned to Canada, bringing home beers I collected at the various craft breweries in New Mexico, a friend who liked to use big words said, "You," he was a bit pompous too, "you are a loco cervezafiel." Well, I didn't know what that meant. And so I didn't know whether to be insulted or flattered. So I asked for his definition. He explained that a locavore was a person who, as often as possible, ate good food that was grown close to home. A cervezafiel was someone who loved good beer. So he said, "You not only love good beer, but you're always telling me that you like your beer as close to where it's brewed as possible." So I decided to call you a loca cervezafiel. That's your word for today. You totally want to go home and use it. Well, several years ago, I wrote a book called Beer Quest West, which was an account of my visits to the brew pubs and craft breweries of Western Canada. And then, after a very early and cold autumn then in Alberta, I decided to move to Albuquerque permanently. And I thought I'd expand my investigation into what they call the frontier of beer. The people at the History Press agreed that was a good idea, and so I started doing research. By the way, you will find if you ever decide to write a book about beer, there's a lot of people who want to help you with the field research. But did anybody help with the index or the proofing or anything like that? No, no way. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy, John. Well, the first part involved reading a lot of books about beer. Well, it has a long history in the world and the United States, but not in New Mexico. The Sumerians, remember we studied them in 5th or 6th grade, or one of those grades. I think it was Rome one year, the Sumerians the next year, and the Eskimos the next year, something like that. But they had a goddess called Ninkasi, and they actually have a brewery somewhere out in California that has that name. Some people have said that civilization began because people had to settle in one place so they could grow the grain to make their beer. How such a process is kind of strange, you know, that creates civilization, but I've seen some pretty uncivilized people drinking the brew that created civilization. Some people say that, and by the time the English arrived in what is now the United States, England, the Germanic countries, and Belgium had centuries-old brewing traditions. Well, in 1609, the people in the new colonies of Virginia advertised around London, England, for a brewer. That's one of the first want ads that they sent back from America across the ocean. And in 1620, the Pilgrims were unceremoniously offloaded in Plymouth. Offload, they didn't use the word offload in those days, that's sort of airplane talk, I think. But the reason they did that was because the beer supplies were running low. And the sailors wanted to have enough to last till they got back to England. Well, in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, breweries could be found almost everywhere in the British colonies and in the United States. Consumed in moderation, it was considered a healthy beverage, and in most cases, it was much safer to drink than the water, which is an excuse I've heard people use when I've told them this thing, again and again. Most of the beers produced were ales in the English tradition, dark, full-bodied, malty. Then towards the middle of the 19th century, political unrest and consequent depression in Europe, particularly in Germany, had a profound effect on the history of beer in the United States. Lager beers, much lighter in color and body and more clean and crisp than English ales, were extremely popular in the Germanic countries. And when many Germans fled their homeland, they brought their taste of lagers with them. Or their taste for lagers with them. Many settled in the Midwest, places like Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. And soon the ones who knew how to make beer and who were good businessmen started setting up commercial breweries. Schlitz, Pabst, Blast, Miller, Anheuser, and Busch, and that's just the ones that we probably remember. As the century progressed, American versions of German-style light lagers became the most popular beers in the country, and still are. Do you know that half of the beers in the United States are produced by Budweiser? And most of the beers produced by Budweiser are what are called pale lagers. In fact, every Budweiser brewery around the world has to send every week by overnight express a keg of what they just brewed of their Budweiser to make sure it meets the people in St. Louis's specifications. You know. Well, let's come to New Mexico. Before the mid to late 19th century, wine had been the dominant alcoholic beverage in the territory. Its popularity was due to the importance of wine in Hispanic culture and due to the fact that it had a relatively long life when bottled and could be fairly easily transported. In the late 19th century, New Mexico was the 5th largest wine producer in the United States. For the history of beer in New Mexico, 1848, the year in which the area became a U.S. territory, is very important. New Mexico was now open to people from England and Northern Europe, many of whom preferred beer over wine. And in 1848, large numbers of Germans fleeing political oppression came to the Midwest, and then later here. Thomas has a great book about the German influence in the Southwest, published by the University of New Mexico Press, and breweries, just one of the contributions that Germany has made to the United States. Linda Ronstadt's family is another. Germans who moved to the southern part of the state to the New Mexican border. During the 1860s, 3 breweries operated in Santa Fe, as well as one in Las Cruces and one in Sapello, just north of Las Vegas. And during the 1870s, breweries operated in Elizabethtown, Fort Union, I may say this one wrong, Golondrinas, did I get that pronunciation right? Lincoln, Santa Fe, and Silver City. In the 1880s, beer was made in Albuquerque, Deming, Silver City, Fort Stanton, Georgetown, Kingston, Las Vegas, and Socorro. And during the last decade of the century in Albuquerque, Kingston, Las Vegas, and Socorro. Well, during the first decade of the century, Albuquerque, Bland, that the beer wasn't Bland evidently, but the town of Bland, Las Vegas, and Socorro hosted breweries. But after the A.H. Reingruber Company opened a brewery in Las Vegas in 1909, there wouldn't be another new New Mexico brewery until 1988. That's when Santa Fe starts up. A survey of the list of early New Mexico breweries reveals 3 interesting facts. First, although Albuquerque, Las Cruces, Santa Fe, and Las Vegas, all roughly on the Santa Fe Trail or the railroad, had a lot of beers, many others operated in what are now ghost towns, or at the best, tiny villages. Places like Bland, Elizabethtown, Georgetown, and Sapello were boom towns, built during the silver and to a lesser extent gold rushes of the later 19th century, and disappearing or dwindling as soon as the mining operations slowed down or stopped. Fort Stanton and Fort Union protected settlers from the so-called hostiles, and also acted as supply centers, so they had the breweries too. Second thing about the 19th and early 20th century breweries is none of them lasted very long. 13 of them only for 3 years, 4 for only 1 year. When the mines closed and the workers departed, the breweries had no reason to exist. Moreover, during the 1880s, the major railroads reached the main centers, and spur lines often connected them with the boom towns. Around this time, more effective ways of shipping in refrigerated cars was developed. And beer is very susceptible to heat and light, so with refrigerated cars, the big boys from places like Golden and St. Louis could start shipping more and more beer. Interestingly, the longest living breweries of the pre-Prohibition era, the Southwest Brewing and Refrigeration Plant, and the name of the St. Louis Brewing Company of Socorro, were right next to rail lines, and they had refrigeration plants. And they lasted but didn't survive Prohibition. Now, they were all, not all, but most of them operated by German immigrants. Koenig, Loeb, Kleiner, Ehrman, Schrenk, Weber, Leininger, Reingruber, Kirschner, Probst, Fischer, Hoswold, and Hamel are among the names that I found as I was looking over the list of the old breweries. They undoubtedly created lagers, including the recently developed Pilsner lager style. And that was a difficulty. A real challenge because lagers require lower temperatures for brewing, for fermenting, and they are more fragile than ales. There must have been some crazy bad beer put back in those places in the middle of nowhere in the 19th century. Well, along comes the great experiment in 1918, prohibition, which did more to create a new industry than ever. I was just reading that Al Capone was released from prison in X year, about 3 days ago. So, but I mean, without prohibition, where would these guys have been? They'd have been selling newspapers on the street corner or something like that. Well, Illinois Brewery of Socorro and Southwestern, that was the name, East Southwestern Brewery and Ice Company in Albuquerque made it through. But unfortunately, by the time Prohibition was over, the major brewers were shipping from other places via railroad in their refrigerated cars, and these people struggled for a few years after the end of Prohibition. And after that, how many of you are from New Mexico? Okay, if you drank beer before 1988, it wasn't made in New Mexico. It came from Arizona, it came from the Budweiser plant near Los Angeles, it came from Golden, it came from St. Louis, it came from Milwaukee, it came from Dallas, that kind of thing. During the 1970s, though, and the 1980s, there had been a small but steady growth of a new kind of brewery, the craft brewery, which did not produce that pale, relatively tasteless beer that had become the mainstream for so many years. There were a variety of ales, each one characterized by a distinctive flavor. The microbrewing movement began in California in the 1970s, and by the end of the 80s had spread to Oregon, Washington State, and Colorado. New Mexico beer travelers going to these places and to Europe discovered that there were beers with taste. And they began to ask why there weren't any microbreweries. Sometimes they were called craft breweries, sometimes they were called cottage breweries, and my favorite, they were called boutique breweries. I mean, that's kind of an oxymoron, boutique brewery, isn't it? Anyway, why weren't there any here? Well, one of the people asking was a fellow called Mike Levis. He was a horse rancher just south of town who owned a business of selling wine bottles to all the small wineries that were growing up around the country. Well, he took action to end the situation, and he purchased a used brewing system from Boulder, Colorado Brewing, set it up in a converted horse barn on his ranch, and in 1988 opened Santa Fe Brewing Company. During the first year of operation, it produced 500 barrels. This year, it's about 30,000 barrels. And they're aiming, they've been down to the breweries at Santa Fe Brewery. They're expanding and moving into other states to sell their beer. They're hoping to reach 100,000. But in the first year, it was just over 500 barrels. And they were relatively tame beers by modern standards. There was a brown ale. There was a pale ale that, compared to the Happy Camper, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, was very tame or timid. And they were what you'd call entry-level beers. That's what craft brewers call the beers that are gentle, non-threatening, non-aggressive. Entry-level or training wheels beers, I've heard them called too. Well, gradually it grew, acquired a loyal customer base in New Mexico. And 25 years later, it celebrated its 25th anniversary, something that nobody would have believed possible when they opened. During that quarter of a century, the brewery expanded its range of styles. A barley wine, which is strong, full-flavored, and full-bodied. It gave rise to a bit of brewery folklore in New Mexico. While members of the brew crew were standing around trying to find a suitable name for the new brew, Petey, some versions of the story call him Charlie, a dasher, In some versions, he's a miniature Dachshund. Any folklorists here, you know how folklore changes as it gets older. Ran amok, killing 20 chickens. Some versions say 27, and that the chickens belonged to a neighbor. Well, his actions inspired the struggling neighbors, and the new product became chicken killer barley wine. Have you ever had chicken killer barley wine? It's really good. That's how it got its name, and that's why you see this dog on the label with a cowboy hat and guns on the side. It's Petey or Charlie or whoever it is after his or the neighbor's 20 or 26 chickens. Well, when the brewery celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, it celebrated it by producing a beer called Saison 25. And this was interesting for three reasons. First of all, 25 years ago, nobody would have ever heard of Saison, had ever heard of it, although it's a very old style European beer. But in North America, nobody really knew much about Saisons. Nobody would have dared brew it because the public wasn't ready for it. But the most interesting thing is, it came out in a can. Now, when the microbrewing cans have been around for a long time, the first ones are in the 30s, and then in the 50s when Coors started producing those really thin, the ones that you could feel strong by crunching with your fingers. But those were for the big brewers. They had connotations of commercialism and so forth. If you were really doing craft beer, good beer, it had to come out in a bottle. Well, it wasn't until about 2000 when Oscar Blues and Scarborough in Colorado started using cans that the craft brewers started picking up on cans. So the Saison and the cans and the fact they'd been there for 25 years was a real accomplishment in the history of New Mexico brewing. Well, that was the background reading I did. The second phase of my research involved travels around the state, visiting breweries, talking to brewers, and sampling their wares. I must emphasize, I was very cautious in that part of my research because I wanted to get home to do the writing. I visited breweries in big cities and small towns, and I went to some places that weren't even small towns. I went up to the monastery outside of Abiquiu. I went to a little hotel north of Silver City. So I went up to Eagle Nest, which was quoted in Canada yesterday, I might add. Well, some of the breweries were in strange places. One was in a place that used to be a butcher shop in the 1890s. One was a 1920s department store. Another was a log cabin built to house a blacksmith shop. And the other was in a Benedict King monastery. So a lot of interesting little places. The brewers had come here from a variety of professions. One had been a music teacher. That's Jeff Irway of Le Combre. I don't know how many are familiar with Le Combre there. He was a jazz music teacher, and he was teaching on the Navajo reservation. And he couldn't get severe Sierra Nevada beer. And he was not only on the reservation, but not in Grants either. So he became a home brewer, and an award-winning one, and now a national rock star in the brewing scene. Another had been a real estate broker. One had been a stay-at-home mother. Now, she didn't just stay at home tippling all the time, but anyway. They all shared two common characteristics. They loved making beer, and they tried to make the best beer possible. The beer was good, and it still is. Last year at the Great American Beer Festival, or this year, excuse me, in September, New Mexico brewers won 8 medals. One of the highest per capita in state relationship, and more than Michigan, which fancies itself as being a great beer state. That's one of their but they run Santa Fe one up here, Blue Corn one up here, and so forth. So 8 medals, which is pretty darn good. Well, I tried a great variety of beer styles. Every brewery had a pale ale, and sometimes several pale ales. I tried English and American IPAs, wheat IPAs, rye IPAs, red IPAs, black IPAs, and even a session IPA. The session means when you can sit down and have a real session at drinking beer. The session beer means you can enjoy. In fact, the word came, they used to feed mild beers to jazz musicians when they finished a session, but it had to be mild enough so they could have 2 or 3 hits still come back and do the job. Well, there's now a session IPA. It has even less of the hops and alcohol and things that we've grown to love. Well, I tried a Dortmunder export made in New Mexico, a California common beer, otherwise known as steam beer, some saisons, a Kolsch, and even a beer that listed prickly pear cactus as one of its ingredients. It was quite good, actually. It was quite nice. There were funny moments. One brewer reported that a customer walked in and asked, "What do you have that's like Bud Light?" And the answer was, "Nothing, I hope." Another man, and this was over at Dual Brewing, that some of you may have been to, just after they opened, it was during the World Series, and a man came in during the World Series. He wanted a Bud Light, but he settled for one of the brewery's Belgian beers. And he said, "Where's the TV?" And they said, "Well, we don't have a TV. People come here to talk or listen to music." What a concept. The man got up and left the beer and just walked out. I saw many interesting signs and slogans, but my favorite was up in Farmington at Three Rivers Brewery. On the door it said, "Husband Daycare Center." And then it said, "Need time to relax? Need time for yourself? Want to go shopping? Leave your husband with us. We'll look after him for you. You'll only pay for food, drinks, and tip. Husbands must," in capitals, "be picked up before," in capitals, "closing." The backstories of the brewers and the breweries were all interesting. And one of the most interesting was Trent Edwards, who you may know as the brewer at Dual Brewery in Santa Fe. When he decided to create a brew pub production brewery specializing in Belgian-style ales, he felt, quote, that it would bring together all my skills and experiences. He'd been a businessman, a painter, I don't mean a house painter, but a painter, a sculptor, and a home brewer. It was the most difficult thing I ever did, he said, after the project was completed a year ago, and Dual was actually serving beer. The steps involved in creating a brewery reflected the ideas of the creative process of one of Edward's most favorite philosopher artists, the French-American painter and sculptor Marcel Duchamp, who said, "In the creative act, the artist goes from intention to realization through a chain of totally subjective reactions. His struggle toward the realization is a series of efforts, pains, satisfaction, refusals, and decisions." Edward views the creation of both Belgian beers and the brew pub in which people experience them as a kind of art. "Drinking Belgian beers is not a minimal experience," he said. "The creative experience, like the experience of viewing a painting, is not complete until the drinker has responded sensitively to the nuances of the Belgian beer style he is sipping." I mean, imagine that. I never heard of Marcel Duchamp until I was writing a book about beer. And I studied aesthetics in English and so forth at college. In the summer of 2013, the date that Dual Brewing, that's what you say when you've had 3 of their Belgian beers, or Dual Doing. Trent Edwards was standing behind the bar, looking happily at a room full of people who were obviously enjoying their evening's experience. My wife phoned and wanted to know when I was coming home. I told her not for a while, I wanted to enjoy the experience, the happiness of having finished my part of the creative process and seeing other people complete it as well. And that was one of the most interesting conversations about beer that I had in all of the breweries. Well, after my explorations of the frontier of beer, I learned that while making beer might look simple, it isn't. You do have the 4 basic ingredients: malt, grain, water, hops, and yeast. You mash the malt to make wort. It's spelled wort, but it's pronounced wort. To make wort, which has fermentable sugars in it. You boil the wort, add the hops, cool the mixture, pitch the yeast, and let it ferment. Sometime late in the process, you add more hops and maybe such flavor enhancers as honey, coffee, berries, ginger, coconut, and even bacon. I had a maple bacon beer. It was interesting. I had it with pancakes, so that was much, much better. But there are so many different varieties of grains and hops, and dozens of recipes for combining these. You can tweak every step. You can mix different kinds of grains together. You can add hops early, or you can add them late. There are different kinds of yeasts as well. There are different kinds of waters and yeast, and you can just tweak all the time. And you come up with so many different beers. I looked up online a couple of weeks ago, and that day I could have had 50 different styles of beer if I drank New Mexico beer only. Different IPAs, saisons, and so forth. I mean, 50 different styles. Well, when I first considered writing this book in the spring of 2012, there were just under 24 breweries and brew pubs in New Mexico. When I submitted the manuscript in the fall of 2013, there were 33. 4 months later, 4 more had been added when the book came out. And I went away this summer and I came back and 8 more had opened up. So the book's obsolete almost as soon as, and that's, if you did that in Colorado, if you did that in California, just about anywhere, by the time you put a book out on microbrewing, it would be obsolete. The stuff in it would be correct, but you'd have to write another volume. Well, why has New Mexico become one of the most rapidly expanding beer cultures in the United States? Well, first, the laws are favorable to small breweries. That's very important. There are some state governments that put every roadblock they can in the way of small breweries. But how they get their license. Now, one of the nice things in New Mexico, every brewery can have 3 tap rooms. Santa Fe has just opened a new one in Albuquerque, so there's a chance for you to try New Mexico beers. There are 16 tap rooms in Albuquerque at the last count, and more on the way. Second, and this is so important, there's a growing number of people who really know and like good beers. I didn't say beer, singular, because before, when we just had Miller, Coors, and so forth, it was all the same, but different beers. You can't get away with brewing a bad beer in New Mexico. The only 2 breweries that folded that I know of in the last couple of years made bad, well, they needed money, but they made bad beer, and people wanted to drink bad beer. Ironically, one of the breweries that folded was called Badass Brewery, and I thought that was kind of symbolic of what happened. Well, third, I think the important thing here is we have world-class brewers. You know, the word rock star I used earlier, but there are 3 or 4 of the brewers here in New Mexico. When they go to beer festivals and so forth, both in the state and out of the state, they're surrounded by their groupies. And that is not just because they're rich or handsome or whatever, but it's because they make really good beer. Well, in closing, I want to share with you what some very wise and sometimes funny people have said about beer. 20th centuries ago, Plato said it was a wise man who created beer. And Ben Franklin said, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. Henny Youngman, some of you may remember him, the comedian, said, when I read about the evils of drinking beer, I gave up reading. And the humorist Dave very emphatically stated, without question, the greatest invention in the history of mankind is beer. Oh, I grant you that the wheel is also a fine invention, but the wheel doesn't go nearly as well as pizza, with pizza. Well, I leave the last words to Christopher Goblet, who is the executive director of the New Mexico Craft Brewers Guild. I was talking to him a few months ago, and he told me about all the expansion plans. Marble in Albuquerque is expanding their brewery. La Cumbre is expanding. Santa Fe is expanding. The demand for the good beer is growing and growing. The rest of the brewing field, the mega breweries, they're showing flat statistics. Craft beer is growing every year in double digits. Well, he said there may be an end to New Mexico's beer boom, but he didn't see it coming for a long time. Then he said, and he exclaimed, he almost shouted, he said, the best is yet to come. Well, I'll drink to that. Thank you very much for helping me celebrate. I'm very happy to answer questions or share your experience.
We were both born and raised in Milwaukee.
Yes.
And learned to really hate beer. So my question is, you said that the German immigrants came over to those areas and intended, to make beer because they couldn't get that kind of beer. Are you saying that those were good beers and we just got a taste of the lesser kinds of beers?
I'll say yes, then answers it. No, I think one thing, there are wonderful German-style beers being brewed in Germany and here. In fact, many brewers have said to me that they discovered what good breweries were when they went on high school exchange trips to Germany. But anyway, and they're also, but what, with everything, the bigger you get, the more you seek a common denominator. Something that everybody will like. Now, I occasionally go to McDonald's, not very often, but once in a while when I'm not hungry. And and I don't want any meat. McDonald's makes scads of money because of A, advertising, and B, a totally inoffensive product to loads of people. And basically, Budweiser and Coors and Miller's make very good pale, what I call pale American lager. Any microbrewer will say they do that style better than anybody in the world. It's consistent all the time. It's just that it's designed to be inoffensive. It does the trick, but it doesn't scare you. Yes, it's homogeneous. So I think that's the answer. And evidently this is something that especially has happened since Prohibition as the bigger brewers bought out the smaller brewers. I don't know, any of you have ever had Rolling Rock? Yes. Budweiser owns it. Anybody had Goose Island? Budweiser owns it. And I could name 3 or 4. But the big beers remain what you experience. Can I tell you a funny Milwaukee beer story? And this has to do with Salt Lake City and the Olympics. Evidently, a fellow from Milwaukee who was not long to live in Salt Lake, and he got really annoyed when all the rights to the beer and all the venues at the Olympics were given out to Milwaukee. Brewery, or to Budweiser rather, to Budweiser. And so he started his own brewery. And his first beer, and you can get this beer in New Mexico now, was called Polygamy Porter. When one is not enough. And that was done deliberately to say, I respect your religion, but the commercialism is shutting out all the local brewers. And then he had billboards. This is when they got him. It showed a fellow coming up with 2 6-packs of Polygamy Porter, and it said, take some home to the wives. Well, the church stuck in, but that was a no license. Yes, sir.
I hope you don't spoil my day, but what about Yingling? I thought they maintained their own.
Yes, Yingling, they do. Yingling is the oldest continuously operating brewery in the United States. It comes from, is it Pottstown, Pennsylvania. And they now have another brewery down in Florida. You cannot get it here. You can get it in some states, but it is a very good beer. And they are the 4th or 5th largest brewer in the United States. But they have developed a beer that has a very great loyal following, and you're obviously a great fan of Yinglings too. It's a real beer. If you're in a beer store, I go to beer stores like I go to bookstores. I love just wandering around looking. But if there's ever Yinglings there, I get Yinglings. Yunglings. On the other hand, Leinenkugel, which you can't get here, is owned by Miller's. And Blue Moon is owned by Coors. Just some of they try to sneak things by saying, look, we're a little brewery.
Shock Top is another.
Yeah, Shock Top is the Budweiser answer to Blue Moon. Exactly, yes.
So are these offshoots of Budweiser and are they mini brew beers or are they pale lagers that are just labeled something different?
No, they are a non-craft brewer's take on craft brewers' styles. Now, they're reaching larger audiences. So the words I use, I never say this beer tastes like whatever. But I will say this is a non-threatening, relatively tame beer. And I think that about the Blue Moon. I don't know, and Shock Top. I don't know if you compare them to real Belgian beers. Anybody ever go to Fort Collins? There's a great little brewery there called Funkworks, and they make Belgian beers that are some of the best Belgian beers not made in Belgium. But they're great. Funkworks. You get off and you just go down a couple of blocks. Whenever I'm traveling up north, I stop and get a stash and take it back and lock it up. But the other thing is, if you travel and you like beer, go and look in a beer store and read the label. For 2 reasons. Read the label so if it says best before date, because beer does spoil. It will go bad after about 3 months. Good beer will go bad after 3 months. But read where it's from, and if it's from near where you're going to stay that night, try it. I spend my summers in Michigan. I drink nothing but Michigan beer. I drink as much New Mexico beer as I can. Unfortunately, a lot of it isn't packaged, so I can't, go up to Farmington for a quick one before dinner or anything like that. But it's the others are tame. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. You're talking about the beer industry. I'm somewhat interested in the wine industry, and I see marketing happening, and some of the stuff is really good, but very clever names. I just read a report on Syrahs, okay, like Shiraz,
Yes.
but Syrah. One is called Carnival of Love. That was a great name. Another one for music fans is called Funkadelic.
Mm.
So you have the George Clinton influence. So I think this is happening in several areas in the alcohol industry, beer, wine, et cetera, et cetera. My question is, I'm seeing, I think, beers that are now 6, 7, 8% alcohol. Is that a trend? Is that...
Yes and no. I'm running for Congress. Yes and no. For the last 15 years or so, there's been a trend to bigger, hoppier beers. And 6 or 7% is nothing. 8, 9%. They're called imperial beers. So yes, but now a lot of brewers are developing. I told you about this Session IPA. I had a wonderful one from Lagunitas, which is a great brewery in California, and it was called All Day IPA. Well, I did wait till half an hour before dinner, but it was 4.75. That's less than. So people are going for that. Lagers, really good lagers, not pale American lagers, but the German-style Pilsners, Czech-style Pilsners, Dortmunder, great German Helleses, German Bocks, and so forth are being brewed now, and so they're coming back, and they don't usually go above 6%. The naming that you mentioned is definitely something that people are getting. I mean, there's local names and so forth, but there's things like Chicken Killer IPA. They have to be careful. Some of them are a little bit over the edge. I won't repeat some of those, but they are working at that. The difficulty, and small wineries have this, is the difficulty is Budweiser spends more in a day in advertising than the entire budget of all the New Mexico breweries combined for a year. And so it's beer festivals, it's articles in the local newspapers, it's talking to your friends, browsing at your favorite beer store. I have one that I go to in Albuquerque called Jubilation. I call it Jubilation Tea, corn pone after the little Abner character, some of them. But it's word of mouth more and more. But people are saying, have you tried so-and-so's latest whatever? But they're never going, some of the Boston lager, Sam Adams, has a big advertising budget. New Belgium is starting. New Belgium, Sierra Nevada, and Boston are so big that they've opened up new plants in South Carolina.
Doesn't Budweiser own Sam Adams?
Huh?
Doesn't Budweiser own Sam Adams?
No, that's Boston Brewing Company. Jim Cole, no, thank goodness it doesn't, no. But there's an interesting thing. I'm sure you've all had a Sam Adams lager. They sell huge amounts of it, and it's very nice Vienna-style lager. But then that allows them to pay for limited edition, really good, expensive beers that don't make money for them. It's like a publishing house. The people that have their names on the thing that are big, like Clancy and people like that, pay for the literary writers who only sell 2,000 or 3,000 copies. Somebody must have a good beer story.
Well, I have one more question. I grew up south of Milwaukee, and you remember when the Vietnam War and they had you can fight and die, but can't drink at 18, and they lowered the drinking age,
Yes.
and they made 3-2 beer,
Mm.
and that really tasted like water.
Yes.
So what did they have to do to the beer to get 3-2?
They get in the brewing process the fermentable sugars, which are attacked by yeast. They eat the fermentable sugars and they excrete alcohol, which makes them one of the most favorite animals among microorganisms. But the more grain you use, the more fermentable sugars, the higher the alcohol.
So they just use very low amounts.
They either lose low alcohol, low malt things, that's where they get the sugar, and they supplement it to try to get the taste. Some brewers can make it lower by using taste enhancing, but not alcohol enhancing barley or oatmeal or
Is that what O'Doul's does, non-alcoholic beer?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. One of the things maybe kind of funny, non-alcoholic beer is beyond the range of my experience. I have had a 3-2 beer made by a microbrewer that tasted really good. Tragedy was he took it out of the market because people would see 3-2. Oh, I'm not buying that. I'm not wasting my money on that. But you cut down or increase the amount of fermentable sugars. Now, what Budweiser does, and any of you at college remember what we used to call the Beast of Milwaukee? Milwaukee's Best? Yes. Grain is more expensive than rice and corn. But rice and corn have fermentable sugars. So they lower the price. That's why it's called value price beer, not cheap beer. In the market they call it value price beer. But it has the same kick, but it doesn't cost as much. And also, some grain is better than others. So if you buy cheap grain and throw in cheap rice and cheap corn, you have cheap beer, which is very popular on many campuses.
You said that beer.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. You said beer goes bad quicker than wines
Yeah.
or whatever. Is it when it's open or if it's sitting on the shelf?
The beer, because beer without preservatives, which is what the big beers, but craft beers generally do not use preservatives, and they last about 3 months. It's like bread. You have bread fresh. It's like overcooking something or leaving something in the fridge too long. A spoiling process starts. But you remember that Corona commercial with the deck chairs and the glasses open. It's sort of like those Cialis commercials, but with beer instead. The greatest enemies of beer are heat, light, and air, and then age. But if you here's a tip somebody told me. First of all, look at the dates. But if you're going into one of these giant liquor stores like Wines Unlimited or something, if there's dust on the shoulder of the bottle or on the top of the can, don't pick it up. It's been there too long. And clear bottles, never. That's a good word. Yeah, never. Well, never say never. You might be on a desert island sometime.
In Colorado, the 3-2 beer only can be sold in grocery stores and convenience stores. And but you can't get 3-2 beer here in New Mexico. Is it illegal or is it just not made?
Well, nobody here makes a 3-2 beer. And probably, given my experience with that 3-2 beer I had,
There's some good ones in Colorado.
but people's attitude here would probably, it takes a while to develop the taste. And outside beer has to come through a distributor. And so does the distributor want to make the investment to pick up whatever it is? Yes, sir.
While you were assembling material for your book, and it's absolutely terrific, did you contact Brad Cross?
I tried to get Brad, but he was somewhere in Colombia at that time opening a brewery up.
He has two in Panama City.
That's where I was, Panama City. I'm sorry, once I get down past El Paso, I forget the names of all the countries. But Brad Cross, I should mention, is sort of the pioneer here in starting microbrewing. And Blue Corn has put through nearly 2/3 of the award-winning brewers in New Mexico. The Blue Corn Channel River outfit, which is part of Blue Corn, there's a school. and the Kraus trained people who trained people. So now we've got the third generation, an assistant brewer who learned from a blue-collar person, just got her first head brewer's job in Albuquerque at Nexus Brewery. And she belongs to the Pink Boots Society, which is a very interesting society. Gum boots, or big boots, are de rigueur when you're working in a brewery because you're always cleaning. But there's an association of women brewers who are encouraging women at all levels of the industry, and they're called the Pink Boots Society. And yes, sir.
Do you have a comment on the commercial where the most interesting man in the world doesn't drink beer very often, but when he does, he drinks Dos Equis?
Well, you know, I had a Dos Equis once in a bar, and I kept looking around for the women. And they didn't show up. But it's interesting that the most interesting man in the world doesn't have a name. The actor who plays him does, but he doesn't. But I like Dos Equis, actually. I think he's a part of the German tradition of good beers. In Mexico, Dos Equis, Modelo Negro, and beers like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, his book is
My favorite beer because I don't have a favorite.
his book is in the gift shop if anybody's interested.